Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hi, I'm Irene Schmidt. I am with Michelle Berger, who's just in charge of the lights, co-chair of the Conservation Commission in Surry, and there are a whole bunch of Conservation Commission members here this evening. We're sponsoring this event because there's a treasure in our community that is under threat, and it's under threat in a pretty immediate way right now. So it's not a time to sort of sit back and not worry about it and assume it'll take care of itself, and that's Emerton Marsh. And so we've brought an expert on saltwater marshes, and to some degree also on Emerton Marsh here this evening. Bobby Van Riper is going to speak with us. He is a native of New York State, got his undergraduate degree in West Virginia, and then did graduate work at the University of Maine, and I think he's been here ever since in the state.
Ever since.
Ever since, okay, good. And he's kind of done an awful lot of things. He worked for, I think, 16 years for DOT, but as a biologist for DOT, so he did some really interesting stuff there. He also worked briefly at Hinckley, so he's had all kinds of experiences. Most recently and now he is working for the Department of Marine Resources, and with a lot of focus on saltwater marshes. And he's a terrific guy just from having talked to him a number of times, and I think you'll really enjoy what he has to say. He's going to speak first about saltwater marshes in general and why they're important, and then he's going to talk about Emerton Brook more specifically. When Bobby is done, Chris Stark, who's one of our select board members, I'm sure you know, is going to talk a little bit about what the town is engaged in doing to try to deal with what's happening with Emerton Marsh. Bobby, do you want them to hold questions or comments, or?
Actually, I think anybody that's got a question, I think raise your hand and we'll discuss it then.
Okay.
And then we can have questions afterwards as well.
And John has asked me, because he's filming this so that we can put a link on the website so people who can't be here tonight can also benefit from this. And so it would be good if you have a question, if you come up, that way you can use the mic and everybody can hear you, in addition to Bobby hearing you, and we can get you filmed, okay? So if you're in the witness protection program, maybe you don't want to do that, but otherwise, I think it would be great if you came up if you had a question, okay? So here's Bobby Van Riper.
Do I need this? Do I need this thing? Can you all hear me pretty good?
Yeah.
Okay.
No?
No?
Oh, we do need it.
What's that?
We do need it.
Oh,
You do need it.
Yes, thank you.
okay. Because that will stop me from gesticulating too. Which means I probably will knock something over as I talk, you know? So, good, thanks you guys. Thanks all for inviting me down here. I mean, this, we started talking about the Emerton Brook project last fall, or what was going on in Emerton Brook and what we could do potentially down the road. But what I'd like to do first is I'd like to talk about salt marshes in general, because we haven't got a lot of them around here. And they are, as I hope you'll find as I talk through this, really important for our future for a number of reasons. My week this way, we didn't turn out the way I expected it to. I was going to put together a full PowerPoint of my own on this, but this is a sort of a story map that's done by a colleague of mine and I that really does the job really well. And I'm going to run this thing and stop it and sort of talk over it a little bit, just because it's more for the pictures than anything else. So let's get, we have about, this neck of the woods, we have about 22,000 acres of salt marsh on a 5,000 mile long coastline. All right, I'm going to stop at this first picture. If anybody recognizes, this is Machias. That big swamp you see there is called the Shoppy Marsh, and that trail there is called the Sunrise Trail. If I play it a little bit further, we'll get a better picture here. It's tough to read all this stuff. That's why I'm going to do the talking and let it go. As you can see, that's on the left there, that's the Machias River. And upstream, you can see where that causeway crosses it. That is a solid causeway that no longer has a bridge attached to it. Back in the two storms in January of 2024, the 10th and the 13th, there was $4 million worth of damage done to that bridge. It's gone. And the Salt Marsh, both places where you see the water flowing in there, were washed away. There's an old rail trail. That's a sort of an economic mainstay for the town. So we are seeing sea level rise. I don't care whether anybody believes in climate change or not. You better believe in sea level rise, because we're experiencing it now. And it's a question of probability when we see it again. That's just the way it goes. Let's run through that. All right, so what is a salt marsh? It's really, we have two really kinds of different salt marshes in Maine. Both of them are very well dominated by two grass species, basically cordgrass and salt hay. And there's a couple of different other little plant species that sort of grow in there, but they're the dominant ones. And the cordgrass is the big one that grows right down along the tide line, the big stemmy thing that grows about 6, 8 feet tall sometimes. And then the salt hay is just kind of a very weak stem plant. As it grows, it just kind of falls over. It gets wet probably on the king tides, stuff like that. And you'll notice that it's all pretty flat. And the reason it's pretty flat is because salt marshes were actually formed by tides bringing sediment in. And that's a key thing to remember as we start talking tonight, is the fact that these salt marshes rely on this supply of sediment. And I'll come back to that. There's another different kind of, these are called fringing salt marshes, and that's what Emerton Brook is. You notice that there's a brook in the middle, and the salt marshes basically fringes either side of the thing. Well, there's also called barrier salt marshes, which are more in the sandier part of Maine, where you got a sand barrier in front of it, and the higher tides wash over it, and that sort of protects it. So we don't have a lot of those up there. There's parts of Korea Heath where it really touches the water, stuff like that, perhaps. That was a good one, actually. That's the Pleasant River down in Columbia, if anybody's familiar with that. That's one of the main salmon rivers. And it's one of the ones where I have a very large project dealing with the towns of Addison and Columbia Falls. Very large project going on where there's a number of groups involved in it, including the towns, and we're going to try to not only restore the wetland and reconnect aquatic habitat, but raise all the roads so that they're going to avoid a sea level rise in the future. We're going to put in bigger culverts so that they drain better. We're going to actually revamp a lot of the town's like subsurface systems like water and sewer. So it's a really huge project. Lots of effort going into that right now. All right, so back to the ecology end of things here. Take a quick look at this picture right here. That's generally what you're going to see in a salt marsh, that sort of look. And the higher the tides, the steeper those banks, usually. And they're pretty slippery, incredibly unstable for the most part. But it's generally the part from the grass out. On that grass, you can take a real fine walk. There's generally peat that underlies that grass. And one of the secrets of that peat is it makes that area very stable once you get into the peat itself. Also, that peat is extremely capable of sucking up atmospheric carbon, called blue carbon. And it's not only carbon dioxide, but methane as well. And methane is really the great big problem as far as warming of our atmosphere over time. Just too much carbon in the air. However, that's a fairly stable situation right there. As we go on, I'm going to go right through the salt marsh geography stuff pretty fast. As I said, they're generally really flat because the height of them is dependent on the tide. So what happens as sea level rises? There's a really distinct thing we have going on here, that most of our salt marshes are degrading right now, but most of our salt marshes are associated with some form of transportation infrastructure. In other words, there's always a road that goes across it somewhere. And generally where that road goes across it, it's the narrowest spot. Let's fill that in and we'll put whatever we got in the boneyard in for a culvert there. So in other words, if you had a 100-foot wide wetland, fringing wetland that got flooded with the tides without anything there, and you built this causeway and a culvert that was 10 feet wide, it went from 100 feet to 10 feet. So that's all the water that's going to get in there. So only about 10% of your sediment's going to get in there. So what's going to happen? That sediment isn't going to be able to keep that elevation where it sits. And so eventually that wetland's going to drown. And that's something we really need to think about down the road. Now I'm going to drop a little bit of a bomb here in a way, in that I'm not smart enough to have thought about this before, but in my travels throughout the internet and dealing with all sorts of other folks who work with salt marshes, there's NOAA Fisheries has done a lot of research on sort of the life histories of sport fish and commercially fished species. And they've come up with this fact that 70% of our commercially acquired marine fish species spend some part of their lives in the salt marsh. Okay, that's a pretty big statement. So if we lose these 22,000 acres of salt marsh, or they are reduced, what's going to happen? If that number was half that, 35%, at 70%, when these wetlands die, 7 out of 10 of every 10 boats out there is not going to be fishing anymore. So at half that, that's critical. That's a critical reason to keep these in place. We talk about a bunch of, we can foo-foo the carbon into things and a lot of the flood control stuff, but if we're talking about fish, we're talking about economies. And so that's where I stand, and that's what my job is. And I actually retired 6-7 years ago. And I came back to do this because it's really, really important in my life. Not to mention that it's more fun than one person should be able to have. So anyway, what we're seeing here is a pretty healthy wetland to a degree. Most of these salt marshes do not have great big open pools of water. And so it's under duress to a point because the pools are called mega pools. And they form where water gets in and can't get back out. It's generally trapped by the fact that there's no sediment coming in there, and all of a sudden the soft spots or some plants die. Of course, these are annual grasses, right? They're going to grow up every year and die back every fall. So that's sort of the source of your peat. So this one is starting to stress a little bit. And I don't want to go too much further into this stuff, but one of the things I kind of wanted to bring in, if I get some time to pull it up a little bit later on, years and years ago, I was part of this group that developed culvert sizing for streams. We thought we did a really good job at doing it. And so we took it out, we took it to this work group that we all worked with for a while. I'm sorry, is someone still?
Yeah, don't stray too far that way.
Okay. I'll be back in the room. So we thought we did a really great job at developing this thing of what the rationale for putting in stream culverts in habitat. In other words, streams that were things lived in. We got up there and we're presenting this thing called Stream Smart. And part of the room was going, yeah. The other part of the room was going, no. And so we said, these guys are great. They think we're doing a good job. But what do you guys think we're doing a bad job for? And they said, well, that won't work for tidal culverts. Because tidal culverts, the water flows two ways, rather than a stream just flowing one way. And it flows two ways. It goes up and down twice a day on different schedules to different heights. So you got a lot more stuff to think about when you do this sort of work. So we went back and we said, how big of an issue is this? And we spent about 5 years collecting information. Is it 15 of these culverts? Is it 30 of these culverts? How many is it? Turns out that along our coast, it's 900. And so it's a very significant number of crossing structures that need, that's the number now. We also look 25 years up the road into the year 2100, and it's going to multiply, it's going to double itself. So I guess I make the point here that it's something we should be paying attention to now. It's not like we got to go out and do every one next week or anything like that, but it's something that I think we need to be all apprised of, is that, given the fact that a lot of our coastal economy is dependent on stocks that come from these areas, it's something we need to think about. But then again, these are a lot harder to do than just a plain old freshwater situation. And one of the first things we have to do, we also developed this program, I'll take a little second to push one of my job functions. The program's called Coastwise. We went from Stream Smart to Coastwise. And what Coastwise does, yeah, right, we were up late thinking of that one, so anyways, what it does, it's basically a sort of a project development guidance to go from the idea of, we've got a problem here, let's fix it, to actually getting it fixed, and then learning about what you did right and what you did wrong, so that you don't do it again next time if it's wrong. So that's out there. It's also not something you can do like overnight. And I've been doing this work for 30 plus years, and I still couldn't stand there and do an entire Coastwise project all by myself. So the point there is, sooner or later, you're gonna have to get the engineer in there. So you'll need a consultant to be able to figure out how much water's going back and forth in there, on what schedule, and what's it gonna look like down the road. Plus, everybody doesn't have extremely deep pockets. You're not gonna put, again, back to that 100-foot wide wetland, if you can pull the whole causeway out, that's a pretty good deal, but you can't always do that. So you're stuck putting a structure in there at some point in time. And so, how big can you get it? Well, the bigger you're gonna put it in, the more expensive it's gonna be. And then two, who's gonna take care of it down the road? Because a lot of these offending crossings are either on municipal roads or driveways or private roads. And usually it's the private roads and the driveways that are the biggest issue. Because usually you'll get a 1,000-foot wide wetland with a 2-foot pipe connecting the two of them. So you have virtually no exchange between the top one and the bottom one. Anything else? I'd like to get onto the subject of Emerton Brook very quickly. Anybody got any questions so far? No? Is it that good or that bad? It was a sleeper. So anyways, let's do that, okay? If you might give me a second. And let's get to Emerton Brook. The important part was the fact that these are important habitats. They mean something to us around here. Plus they're kind of fun to mess around in, really, unless you fall down that slope and there's no way back up. And you have to walk. I had to do this once. I had to walk like 2 miles to find I fell down a slope that was probably 8 feet. And there was nowhere you could find to climb back up it. There's a secret to that, but that means you got to haul a ladder around with you. And so, I'd get down the brook and I'd climb up a way and then you'd fall down. By the time I was completely covered with mud. I was slimed right out. And of course, this was in Scarborough Marsh, which if you've ever been down there, you know that it's like this traffic nightmare. There's traffic everywhere. So there were actually 3 of us that were walking down the side of it, I think it was Pine Point Road, just covered with mud. And I was expecting the cops to show up at any moment. So anyway, give me a second, I will pull up my Emerton Brook project. Yay, is it showing? It is, yes. This is always the craziest part of the whole thing. We were talking about that before. Is fooling around with the electronics, right? Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, there we go. It's a little slow. But what do you know? Is that showing? Oh, that's not bad. Of course, it's more than I want to go. All right, so that's a clip of a Google map of the section at Cross Road and up above it. As you'll see, if you follow it up from Cross Road, there's a number of little sub-watersheds. And up under Emerton Brook, it looks like it broadens out into there. I took a look at, sort of follow this along at the elevational level here. And what it does is it's not very distinct if you're looking at it on the ground, but it goes up like that, which is like good point number 1. Okay, down the road, as sea level rises, you've got an elevation that's going to work with you to have that sediment show up in there, right? So that's really a very good thing about it. And then I've got a bunch of pictures. Mark was kind enough to send me a bunch of photos. I kind of want to go through them pretty quick and get to the actual meat of the discussion here. This one was actually off of Google Earth, and that's a pretty nice spring shot of that's pretty average full tide, high tide there. And here's one that's not quite so average. This was the flood that was there. And I'll show Chris's movie in a second. He's got a really great movie that shows it in motion. So it's gone underwater. Now I have a question for you guys. How often does that happen right now? More often than not, or just occasionally?
Once a decade.
Okay, yeah.
Stanley said he's never seen more than just a spray on the road.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not water.
I mean, that was, I'm guessing, but that was probably one of those January storms.
This was January 10.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, something to think about anyway. I mean, it's, like you say, it might not happen all that overtopping might not happen all that often. Just something to think about, something to keep in your mind as we work forward on stuff like this. Another shot of the marsh full of water, looking pretty good overall. One thing I don't have a picture of, this is back when the bridge was in there, which was pretty interesting. The bridge had to fail, right? That had to fail. Because why would you take it out if it didn't? You know, I mean, the good old way is, like I said before, let's just find the narrowest part in the stream and then fill it in with rocks and throw whatever we got for a pipe in there and see how that works. So at one point in time, there was a bridge in there. And this one, I actually like this one a lot, this slide, because it gives you, I'm going to throw a word out there that I just love because it doesn't mean anything. It's called the thowway. It means a lot in Eastern water law. And what it is, see that blue line that runs up through there? That's the thowway. And the thowway, in any river channel, the water's going to run faster in some part than it does in any other parts. Usually where the resistance is least, which is somewhere in the middle. But it depends on what it's running over as far as gravel. It's the deepest part. Now, Eastern water law says that if you own property up against a stream, that your property line runs to the thowway. So the way to find out is get yourself a stick, and hopefully the water's not over your head, and go out there and find the deepest part, and then sort of connect the dots. And that's where, then go out there 6 months later, and you go out there, and your line will be completely different. Because the stream is actively eroding all the time. So this shows where it was, but it also shows not only a tidal inundation, where the water usually sits at most mean lows, but it also shows the high tide lines as well. So that's a good working diagram for engineers down there. All right, as far as what we saw in place that was down there, right now at the crossroad crossing, there's an undersized culvert that's embedded at the wrong elevation, and you can see that in several different times. Number one, and we have a picture of that Chris gave me, is that as the outbound water comes in and stacks up above the outside of that pipe, once it gets above that pipe, you'll start seeing a whirlpool. Because what's happening is the mass of water, the weight of that water is growing, and gravity's pushing down from it. And at the upstream end of that pipe, on the inboard side of that pipe, water's just hammering out right at whatever bank of the wetland is right there. So in other words, it's it's an unnatural situation. I mean, it's certainly generating sediment, but it's already sediment that's there. So, point one, the causeway appears to be sinking a little bit. It looks to me like if you look at it, usually there's a distinct line that's an arc from one end to the other. Well, it looks like portions of it have dropped a little bit. So another thing to think about is that maybe, usually the correct way to put in a culvert when DOT goes out and puts a culvert in, the minute they dig the hole, they put a guy in there with a tamper. And he's tamping down that bottom because that culvert needs something dense to sit on. Otherwise, when you put that fill on top of it, it weighs something and it's going to sink that culvert. That's why when you go over and improperly place culvert, the road goes boom, boom, like that. So that's a little bit of something we need to think about. Both ends of the crossing are eroding faster than is natural. And you can see that because there's dug holes on either side of that pipe. So that water's coming out of there with pretty close to the same velocity it went in with. So it's both ways. It's sort of sandpaper in that bottom out of there. Okay, and we were just talking a little bit before about how there used to probably be, what was that, horseshoe crabs in there. Well, horseshoe crabs rely on a little bit more of an organic sediment to sort of lay their eggs in. And so what's happening is organics are always lighter than mineral. So those are getting kind of washed out, and the minerals are what's left. So that's probably why they're not just a guess from standing up here at night on a Thursday, but, you know, pretty close. Biologists. And again, I mentioned before that the marsh has a really good probability of survival of sea level rise. The question being, what do you do ultimately with the sediment budget for it? So that keeps raising its head, doesn't it? So it's, and the road, this is just me observing from some goomba from Temple, Maine, that the road's about a mile long, and it looks like it's a shortcut from here to there. Something else to think of. So back to that question in the very beginning, how regular does it flood? But, you know, and going nowhere, we'll just say that it did, and it might. Fair enough? Okay, so, anyway. So, all right, so what could you do? If you decided you wanted to do something here, what could you do? Well, and so, every time you go out for federal money under the law called the National Environmental Policy Act, you have to list your alternatives. And the first one you have to list is no action. What if we did nothing? You know, and that's something that all of these, I believe that the town needs to really kind of think about and figure out where you want to go with it. Because doing nothing is just that. It's, you know, I mean, I don't know. Is it a maintenance issue right now? Is it, you know, where could you go with it? Or you could replace the culvert. You could reset the present pipe because it's too small, but if you might be able to cut the blast down a little bit if you reset it at the proper elevation. Or you could upsize the pipe right there, or you can add another pipe. That sort of thing is going out right now, because the minute you add another pipe, you've added what we call a crab catcher in there. And as you know, the tides are going to go in and out, and they are going to bring stuff with them. And so it's kind of that stuff always gets stuck between the two pipes. Then you could put a rigid bridge structure in there, which is, kind of pricey. But it's a very good option. You are really opening that opening up to allow more sediment in there. So there's a rationale there, certainly. You can also armor the causeway so that it's much more of a dam than it is now. On the opposite side of that, has anybody been down to the Bailey Island Bridge? Has anybody ever seen the Bailey Island Bridge? For those of you who haven't seen it, it is this great big cut granite stone causeway. And it's always been of interest to me because, you know, it's still a causeway, but it's got holes in it. And the water can get through it. You know, the water can't get through it the same sort of velocity or, you know, carrying capacity for sediment that if it wasn't there, but the door is open. And so I asked the folks at the Harpswell Road Commissioner's office, I said, is that a problem? They said, well, occasionally you tree gets stuck on it, but really no. It's fairly maintenance-free. And I said, how long has it been there? They said, since the turn of the century, the 20th century. So it's something that I've never done before, but it sounds pretty cool. You know, I have no idea what it would cost in today's world, but it certainly worked in one spot it's in, right, so far. So then on bottom of all that's just like pull a plug on the thing, take the whole thing out. But that means you'd lose Crossroad as a through street. So that's what, I mean, me sitting in my little office thought up of as alternatives. Certainly not everything, and certainly not, so I don't think anybody should limit themselves to those as well. So what do you all think about this stuff? I've talked enough. My throat's dry.
So Bobby, I just have a question. Where in this does the box culvert fit?
That would be in the culvert replacement end of things. Because you're going to try, you know, once you start getting into looking at these alternatives, you're going to look at these culverts and you're going to go, do you really want to put another metal culvert in there? No, you really don't, not in a marine situation. Because it's not going to have a long design length unless you put an anode system on it. So, I mean, it's gonna be, that's gonna be where the electrons come, it's where it's gonna, wash away quickly. So you're gonna wanna use either plastic yoke or concrete. And the concrete you're gonna wanna use is, if you can do it, a three-sided structure. But you have to found a three-sided structure on something. Or you could put a bottom underneath the thing and set it down even further. But there are design considerations with both of them. So that's what you'd be looking at under that sort of alternative, is alternatives in your alternative, pretty much. So, anyway, what do you all think? What do you? Yes, sir.
I need those
Oh,
stats.
can you come on up here and
Tell me the numbers again. The 30% of the species spend 70% of their lives?
okay,
Or
it's,
70% of the species spend 30% of the, and where'd you get those numbers?
that's on the NOAA Fisheries website.
Noah.
NOAA, NOAA, right.
Okay,
And it's 70% spend some portion of their life
yeah.
cycle.
Okay.
Okay, so it's indeterminate how long, but also think about this too. It's just the commercially acquired species. They gotta eat something, So if they're in there,
Not disputing it.
no, I
Just
understand.
trying to do the math.
Yes, right, yeah. But so I guess I'm just trying to say that, it's the proportion that spends their time in there, and that's not really a complete picture of that, what's going on. I guess that's my point right there,
Right.
So anyway, I mean, was it,
Hold on.
cool, thank you. Anyone else, questions-wise, right now? I mean,
This may be a very naive question, but when we talk about bridges and we say, oh my God, bridges are just so horribly expensive, it seems to me that, branding myself as a dinosaur here, but it seems to me they used to put in those bridges on pilings. And
yeah.
they seem to last a long time, and it seems that there's an awful lot of water exchange under them. You know what the ones I mean, that are the
Yes,
wooden pilings?
there's, with a bridge structure, again, too, it has to sit on something. And so what an engineer will do, he'll put what they call the seal, which is what either the abutments or the piers sit on. Will have to either sit on ledge, or it will sit on something that's what they call driven to refusal, which is usually a great big H pile that's weighing down till it hits ledge. Probably at however big the bridge is, the number's gonna be relational to that. Then that's where they build their piers and their abutments on. And sometimes that works, sometimes it's 300 feet to refusal. And it's really, the coast is a little easier though, because we tend to be a little bit more rock bound down here. That in my little town, which is just rock and clay, so.
But what did they do before they had, the ability to, I mean, they built those bridges hundreds of years ago.
Bridges with a lot shorter design lives is what
Okay, so they
it
just
came
didn't
down
last.
to, yeah.
Okay.
Because many of the older bridges were stone. If they were really,
No, I'm talking about the wooden ones.
yeah, well, the wooden ones were just wooden ones. Wooden ones don't usually, especially out in the environment. Back then there was no really southern pine, pressure treated southern pine. So you were just using whatever wood you had there. Yes.
Do you have a feel for some of the other places in Maine that have gone through similar kinds of things, maybe before we have? Different options that they've used that have worked or haven't worked, their approaches, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I got a project going on in Freeport right now. And of course, we have to remind ourselves it's Freeport. Okay, and so, enough said. Anyway, but it's what they ended up is putting this massive structure in. And it works okay, but it costs a heck of a lot of money, number one. And number two, there's another one up above it, about 50 feet, that they ran out of money, they couldn't do anything with it. So, it's, we're still really learning about this stuff, and one of the big things is, like I said before, when you got the idea to begin with, and all of a sudden you got it on the ground, Well, what Coastwise says you gotta do is you gotta monitor that for about 5-6 years to see if what you did worked. Because there's still a learning curve on this stuff. But, I think the habitat's important enough where, we need to invest in it at some point, Yeah, George.
How much of this religion do your former colleagues from DOT buy into?
Actually, quite a bit of it. I actually have a great big meeting with DOT to talk about funding next week for Salt Marsh related projects. DOT has gotten there was a marsh years ago called Sherman Marsh that they maintained a dam on. That when the dam blew out, it let a lake go, it washed out wetlands all below it, washed out a bunch of roads. And so they're really, the train of thought has changed quite a bit. Plus, I find them, as I said, I worked there for 17 years almost. Never once did I get Employee of the Month. Because I was always cranking about, we gotta do this. And, here I am, a biologist, there's like 50 engineers and one biologist. I could run fast. But, so it's really has changed significantly. And I look at DOT right now as a really good partner. I have a job with them down in Scarborough Marsh where I'm trying to plan for future survival of the marsh, and they're trying to raise the rate grade on US Route 1 that drives through the marsh. They have to pay a mitigation bill that's huge as far as law goes, but I'm making the mitigation for them, so it's free. So it's, there's a little bit of back scratching going on there, but they're also realizing, one of the points I guess I didn't say is that if we go back to the fact that these are like municipal roads and driveways, there's a program that DOT has called the Local Bridge Program, and it's sort of a cost share thing about replacement and maintenance of smaller bridges. Well, that runs to, I think now it's maybe 12 feet. Any bridge over 12 feet becomes DOT's bridge. It's kind of like asking somebody to do more work for less money. They don't really want to accept any more responsibility in that light. And you can't blame them. But if you look at what we're trying to do here, we're trying to the important part is letting that sediment back on the marsh. So you want a wider opening. So the discussions I've been having is that, what if we make these specific maintenance agreements that anything less than catastrophic maintenance, meaning you got scour under the middle of the bridge structure or whatever that, the local road crew can't handle, that DOT would come in and do. But average maintenance on the structure stays with the towns. But then you start talking about cost of structures as they get bigger, and it gets exponentially larger as you keep getting a longer bridge. So, it's something to think about too. I don't think of any of these are sort of out of the perspective of the usual, say, bridge project replacement at the moment, though. Yes, sir.
Now, if you go upstream of the outlet of, like what you're just describing there, and you look at the marsh, where is the sediment, where did the sediment come from that creates that marsh? Did it come from uphill inland, or did it come in through the outlets?
It's sort of a combination of the two.
Now, where is most of it coming from?
Actually, it varies. It depends on what they call the terminal moraine of the glacier was, when that glacier started melting back 10,000 years ago. And so we don't really have a historical record of what the tides looked like, as, we're talking in periods of
But before any constriction was there, before you put a bridge in or anything like that, where was the sediment coming from? Was it coming from the ocean, or was it coming from the rivers flowing down?
And again, both ways. But
yeah, but which was most of it? That's what I'm asking.
It's hard to tell because it's different in every wetland.
I find that very hard to
It's
believe.
site-specific, yeah? Nope. If you've got a narrow fringing wetland...
Sediment is dirt that's been washed from somewhere else, and you don't get very many deep waves out on the ocean creating sediment that's being carried in.
Actually, that's where the power lies, is incoming tides. and you
Well,
get.
that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
But is it coming from, it's not coming from the deep ocean, it's coming from the shorelines above that place and below that place, and coming from the rivers coming down.
You're correct, yes.
So most of the sediment is coming from the land and not the ocean.
Not the supply that's keeping it busy now, keeping it in place now.
I'll bet if you did some analysis of the sediments, and did you find most of it was?
Yeah, I'm not a geologist, so I can't, I'm not like an authority on something like that. Yes, sir.
It's hard to get money to fix outside money to fix a municipal road. But apparently there's money to take care of marshes, wetlands, and things like that. If the cure here for the wetland, for the marsh, is the road, doing something to the road, can that, I mean, is there a break? Can that money be used to to change the road, to change the blockage, and therefore automatically fix the marsh? Or is there some legal reason or so to say that you've got to get money specifically for a marsh? And in other words, if the road is changed, if the culvert's taken out, and that's enough to repair the marsh over years or decades, can you use the marsh money for that?
I don't really know how to answer that question, because the funding can come from any number of buckets to address a project like this, depending on where you want to go. Yeah, Ellen, maybe you can.
Yeah, Bobby, no, I don't have an answer.
Oh.
Questions. Really, can you speak a little bit more about restoring the marsh? Will the marsh restore itself with the removal of the current?
Yeah, actually, I didn't.
Or is there something needing to be done, like reseeding or stabilizing banks or something else?
Well, historically, when people first came to Maine, they brought with them their vehicles, which used hay as fuel.
Yep.
And so you look at one side and you got trees that are 70 feet tall. Then you look at the other side and you got this hayfield out here, right? So the problem with that hayfield was you got flooded twice a day. So you only had 12 hours to use it. So what they did was they made a mosquito problem 50 times worse. They built all these berms. And then you tried to drain it in all the wrong spots. So the mosquitoes were even worse. So they didn't get really a lot of production out of their animals, but they moved stuff along. I don't think with the size of Emerton Brook that it was used very much by humans. So I don't think you're going to have to do a lot of rehab work there. Virtually there's no of those mega pools that I was talking about before there whatsoever. It is a fairly narrow marsh, and so but like I said, it does go uphill, which is the big deal. George,
Is there an equivalent of an EKG or a fitness test for an existing marsh? And can a marsh get to a point where it's fatal?
Yeah, and usually the first sign are those mega pools. The second sign are these, what they call extensive pans, where what happens is there'll be grass that isn't salt tolerant, that the marsh doesn't get floated in this spot, and stuff that's not salt tolerant will grow there, and that won't last on a big flood. And so you get this sort of depression where these plants have died, and the water sits in there and evaporates, and so it gets really, really, really salty. And that's like a key thing. And you can see it, because you can walk out on a dry day when there's no tide there, and it's whitish. You can actually see a deposition. So there's varying degrees of it. Then there's always the fact that, I'll make my pitch here. At Scarborough Marsh, they really love their marsh, but they just built a tractor supply in it. So that's another really kind of way you can tell that it's going downhill. Another thing is you see plants growing there that aren't supposed to be there, like Phragmites, that big tall common reed. That's a freshwater. It's an imported freshwater plant, and it likes really sweetened water that comes running off of properties that fertilize their lawns and stuff like that. And so that's another. I'll use that Scarborough Marsh again. 20 years ago, I had to dive the culverts under the causeway, and you could see Phragmites up around the upper rim of the marsh. Right now, they're growing down both sides of that causeway, that Route causeway. So, you've got megapool formation, pan formation, invasive species, development crunching in, especially in southern Maine. We don't have it quite as bad up here. A little smarter to keep out of the water up here. So,
Do we,
If you applied those criteria to Emerton Marsh,
none of
We
them
don't have
exist
any-
there. Actually, we were talking about this before. Our Maine natural areas took a look at the place. And they came back saying it's pretty diverse as far as, vegetation species go. So in other words, you go back to Aldo Leopold years ago, the more complex things are, the more resistant it is to dynamic changes that may happen in the environment. So in other words, it could get banged around a little bit and it would survive longer than someplace that just had a couple of species in it. Yeah, just
so there was a bridge there before
Yeah.
that failed. Do we know what kind of a bridge that was or why?
I don't know that much of anybody here that,
I was told by people who bought their property in the borough in 1947, and they said there was a wooden bridge there.
A wooden?
a wooden bridge.
A wooden bridge in 1947, and it was replaced with a 7-foot culvert. Now we have a 5-foot culvert.
Can you repeat that? What Mark just told us? Some of us.
Yeah, there was a wooden bridge there at one point in time, and I'm gonna imagine it either washed away or collapsed. I mean, we don't know,
In 1947, there was a bridge.
So 46, they put a 7-foot culvert in. And then, at some point in time, went back and they put a 5-foot culvert in.
And that's what we have now?
Yes, that's what's there now.
Would it be incredibly difficult to put in a 10-foot culvert?
You gotta dig it out, you gotta pack it down, you gotta put it back in. Once you get to 10 feet of diameter, you start talking about pieces of culverts. Because they get so big that the machinery, you gotta put something really big on that site. You're not really gonna get, a 100-ton crane sitting there probably. So you're gonna have to put it in pieces. But that's not like sort of an uncommon transportation project, really. Like it's done quite often, as a matter of fact.
And what's the length of our bridge now?
Geez, it jumps out about halfway down that causeway. If you use 2 to 1 and 12 foot, probably about 60, 65 feet. The issue is the barrel of that culvert, as that water builds up on either, has the peak on whatever side that, if the tide's coming in, if that gets higher, that gets pushed through that pipe, and it's, you only got so much pipe.
Yeah.
And so you're gonna get a little bit of a Venturian effect that's gonna shove it out the other end. So you're getting sort of an advanced amount of energy going back and forth on it. Yes?
What are the sort of costs associated with just removing it? Would there be rehabilitation to the area if you just took that causeway out and opened it up?
Yeah, I think if you want that route, you definitely need to stabilize that area where the causeway was. Because you really don't, like I said, it's sinking, so that means that there's something under there that's soft. They didn't get it down to something hard. So, pulling all that out, and nowadays, I think there's enough velocity of water going in there. You kind of want a combination of sort of hard stuff and nature-based solution. Meaning logs and stuff to grow behind the log, backfill and stuff like that.
You would line the bottom with something hard, you're saying?
Yeah, to a degree. You're gonna erode from the top down, because usually, always in a tidal situation, that is sort of used to it to a point, but it's like pulling a Band-Aid off a cut you just had. You still need to kind of protect that part for a little, till it heals up a little bit.
And is that expensive
Compared
compared to building a bridge? Or?
In relation to the replacement, it's probably the cheaper option, but at the same time, you gotta remember what you lose, right? I mean, there's the upside that you don't have it, but there's the downside that you don't have it.
So why do you need the bridge?
Depends on where you want to keep the road on.
What's on the other side of the bridge?
The other side of the road.
No, if you go down the road and cross the bridge, what are you going to?
Well, that's what, as I understand it, it's a shortcut, right?
What's down there that makes you want to have the road there?
There are homes down
I've
there.
got-
Your house, okay.
Okay, yeah,
That's
well,
what I'm getting at.
see, now, that's a good point. I mean, I don't really have that stake.
So maybe what you want to do is have a series of bridges that let water go through underneath instead of one big culvert.
And that's another option right there.
And maybe 3 or 4 miles of bridges so that you get flow.
Well, you'd actually find that your cost may go,
Well, but that's what I'm getting at, which is cheaper,
Yeah,
one big
yeah.
bridge or several little ones.
yeah. George?
What would be a swag for the cost of the engineering analysis to identify the options and put price tags on them?
Oh, I think it would depend on whatever engineer you put on board.
Just a swag.
I'm guessing 20,000 to do the high. I just had one done on a relatively a bigger marsh than that. It was about 25,000 bucks. You know, because what they do, I don't want to get too Mr. Engineer here, but what they do to size these pipes is the tide's going in, tide's going out, right? So if it's restricted anywhere, it's going to build up. So you've got a peak that's going to build up on one side. Then if it's going out, it's going to build up on the other side. What they do is they take both peaks and they try to bring them down so that they're either equal or flattened out. So in other words, the water's going through it fairly well unimpeded. Yes?
Is there ever a situation where it doesn't drain in between the tide? Or does it empty properly right now? What I mean is, for example, we've had some very high tides this last month, and we drove past there, and the water was very high. I mean, it was very high, it was up in the trees.
Yeah.
So you look at that and you say, okay, so is that all going to be able to leave with that existing culvert? Does it all drain out, or is there ever a situation where the water's still backed up in there so you don't get the flow for the next incoming tide?
You know, I'll answer that honestly, I don't know, but there's certainly a possibility.
And that's,
Because-
and that's a problem?
Right, if you flood it with a big tide, and you get 2 big tides in a row, then that water might not have all the time to drain out before that next tide comes along.
And the result of that is what?
What's that?
And the result of that is what? If the water is not flowing and basically ecologically cleaning that out, what is the long-term effect of that? So, for example, if all of a sudden we go from having high tides of 13 feet to 13 and a half feet or 14 feet in the next 2 or 3 years, if that continually fills up a couple times a month and does not empty the whole time when you've got maybe 3 high tides in a row, is that going to hurt the marsh? Not from an erosion perspective, but from a health perspective.
You know, I don't think so much for a health perspective, it's just not the natural sort of flow of things.
Okay.
So, and I you know, in honesty, I don't know how to answer that question to be, you know, whether it's biologically significant, whether the stuff stays or goes. You know, it might be actually beneficial to some degree, because if you're not moving water, you're dropping sediment,
And it's not.
right? It takes moving water to move sediment, right? So, yes, ma'am.
What is the significance of the sediment to the marsh?
The significance is the fact that it maintains the elevation of that marsh in an unimpeded situation. When we have a tide come in, you got the whole power of the ocean bringing that tide in. So versus when it's coming back out, it's just that little area draining back out, right? So in a situation where there was nothing there and it was unimpeded, 100 feet wide wetland, getting 100 feet wide of tidal inputs, that sediment would flow in, and it would, where that tide stopped, it would drop it. So what would happen is that over time, the elevation of that marsh would be right where that tide dropped it. And so that's kind of the point. If you went down from that 100 feet and you put a 10-foot culvert in, you're only getting whatever percent, 10%, let's say, just for math purposes. So it's only getting 10% of that sediment, it may go that far, but it might not be enough to maintain that elevation. And so what's gonna happen is, you're gonna get big tides coming in there, it's gonna drown it. That make sense? Okay. Yes, sir.
So if it was 100 feet wide and it was originally coming in, the tide was coming in, it had 100 feet to put that in, tide starts to change, the sediment drop, goes back out. You don't lose all of it because the culvert is now going down lower. And the marshes up here and the culvert's down here, so you're still getting, I'm not saying you're getting the flow that you had before. There must be a formula to figure out what would give you about the same.
And that's what the engineer is for. And you're right, though. There's an exchange of sediment. It doesn't just go in and stay
What I'm
there.
talking about is because the culvert's down, where when it was just a marsh, it probably wasn't this big ravine in the middle going down as deep. You get flow. Do they ever use an oval culvert?
A lot of times, yeah. They use them especially where you can't get a lot of fills in on top of them. You know, because well, again, almost all the oval pipes out there, they're making plastic ones now, but they were metal.
Right.
And again, you know, unless you got an anode system, you don't want to put metal in the water, or in salt water, let's put it that way. Unless you want to put culvert in every 10 years or so. So, yeah, I mean, the big deal with that is that you'd still get that exchange. You know, you're looking for sort of that volume, though, to bring that stuff in and put it up there. As you cut down the size of that culvert, the volume that you can bring in is going to be less, just by the nature of the fact that you're not going to get that much water through a small opening, right? I mean,
You had said something earlier about it being a positive, that the elevation upstream, the elevation of the marsh increases.
yes, but
Can you
it's not like it's
address
going like that.
No, I understand, but
Right.
can you address why that's a positive?
Well, yeah, when you have sea level rise, you still have a continuous surface so the thing can survive, right? So as the water goes, if you have it's called a gradient, right? If it's going uphill, as that sea level rise goes, it's going to be able to keep pushing that water further and further historically, right? Like there's a brain trust down in the Capitol called the Maine Climate Council. And they said, well, we're going to have 3.9 feet of sea level rise by year 2100. Well, I don't know what will happen. At the same time, it's coming up. It's starting to rise. And if you don't have something to sort of address that rise, you know, you got a combination of things. As the sea level rises, you got to have some slope to climb to some degree. But then you go back to the natural situation, and the tide should have been doing that work for you, even in flat ground. Right?
In terms of dropping sediment.
Right. So the issue is, I'm going to go back to what I said before. Almost every wetland that has a problem has some damn road crossing on it somewhere. You know? And so, but we're sort of changing the outlook on these things too. Used to be, you go to the DEP and they'd say, you know, if you can fix all the wetland in the world, and we're going to give you a pat on the back. But the minute you go down and change that structure, and you go over 1,000 square feet of impacts, which is like you wake up on one of these jobs, there's 1,000 square feet of impacts, we're going to make you file an individual permit, mitigation, all this other stuff. Well, I've been kind of pushing these guys, and I said, look, I can't fix that without fixing this. And so we need to figure out some common sense way how to get around that stuff. And so they did. They found me a way. They said, if you come to me and you say that you're going to use best available BMPs, best available ways to do it in adaptive management, and you're going to want to restore that culvert, you can do any darn thing to that crossing structure you want with a permit by rule. So, and that, I have to tell you, is major. Coming from these guys, it's major, you know. But it's kind of putting all the pieces together. You can't do one without the other. You know, the issue now is working with the DOT to find out how you're going to get that bigger structure in there how you're gonna maintain it in the future, and who's doing the paying for what, right? So, I mean, these jobs are all doable. These aren't like, there's not a heck of a lot of, even like Alan suggested before, maybe, having to rehab these wetlands. A lot of that's not rocket science either. You basically knock the berms out, you look at the topography of the marsh, you drain it the right way, you replant it, you let it heal for a while. Then you fix your structure. So, these are all doable things. It's just a question of, we haven't done that many of them yet. And so, that's why I think I made the mention before to somebody that one of my big efforts is trying to get pilot projects on the ground. And one of the reasons I never got Employee of the Month at DOT is because I used to like to try to do things cheap. Cheap and good those were my merit badge words, because they were like expensive and good, And so a lot of the stuff I was able to do there, like culverts, ended up being cheap. It's a cheap fix, you get a lot of bang for your buck out of it, right? You put it, plus, if you think about this stuff, this is where the title structure is the same way. If you put the right structure, you only put it in once, and you expect it to have some sort of design life, in other words, last so long, if you put a decent structure in there, you've extended the design life and you've reduced your maintenance costs. Okay, so what do you want to do? What do you want to spend your money? Today's dollars or future dollars? To me, I put the pipe in and walk away. It took 5 years. I mean, I used to get beat on by engineers on a daily basis because I keep asking them for bigger pipes. But once they put them in, the maintenance guys are like, "You're rocking, baby." So, these are, like I say, these are all doable projects. Emerton Brook is really a doable project. What do we want to do? And I think that's sort of in the town's belt where you guys want to go with it. My job is, besides standing up here and slinging baloney at you for a half an hour, is to basically, whatever you decide to do, I'll give you whatever help you need. Fair enough? Yes, ma'am. Yes,
One more question. Did you just say that, I sort of thought you were implying that there was value potentially to doing restorative work on the marsh prior to dealing with the culvert, and I thought it was the other way.
No, that's part of the process. If you're doing both of them,
okay.
And that's one of the reasons why DOT or DEP agreed on the reduction in permitting. The marsh needs to heal before you dump more water on it. Because if you've just taken these berms off and filled in these new ditches and dug different ditches in different spots to drain it correctly, they're all going to be pretty raw. And you start throwing a storm tide on that, and that 6-inch ditch that you just dug, going to be 1.5 feet deep, and you're going to be down into the peat. You're going to be one of the things that's the downside of salt marshes, and you're seeing it in Emerton Brook, is that as that erosion blasts that stuff away, those sections become, remember at the very beginning I showed you that photograph that was pre-stable banks, greasy, slimy stable banks? Essentially, those are pretty healthy looking. Once they start sloughing off and exposing that peat that's underneath, that's when the methane starts escaping. And it escapes really pretty easy. And methane's a bigger issue because you light a match, methane burns. You light a match, carbon dioxide doesn't. So methane has got a lot of nasties about it, and it's a very simple molecule, difficult to control. Ta-da! I'm going to hand the microphone over. Thanks, man.